Let's begin first, though, with our first guest. Joining me, former Air Force pilot Bill Hensley. Bill, thanks for being here this morning.
My pleasure.
We're going to talk about a couple of things. Let's start with the crash itself. Those are the images that are still in our minds. Yes. Not just the one in Virginia, but the one here, because it did remind us that we had the same kind of problem here. What do you think caused this crash in Virginia?
The crash in Virginia, the naval spokesman, as you heard, suspects a catastrophic mechanical malfunction. And I think that probably should be top on the list. And the reason for it is this. You have a critical phase of flight. You have two qualified pilots on board. You had an instructor pilot, and you had a pilot who had his wings, and he was simply upgrading to the F-18. So you have a lot of brain power on board that aircraft. So the fact that they crashed, as a result, there would probably be very minimal possibility of human error. Because of the qualifications of the pilots.
When you talk about mechanical malfunction, obviously there's powertrain and there's control of the airplane. Do you think it was an engine flare-out, if that's the proper term? Do you think it was some other issue with control of the airplane? What do you believe?
Okay, it possibly is both. One of the things that I'd like to demonstrate to you using this model regarding the engines. Now, there's an AP photo that's been published and put on widely disseminated. And in that AP photo, you'll notice the empennage, or the tail section of the airplane. And the photograph is from the rear. And these here are the exhaust pipes of the engines. In a jet aircraft, these are called nozzles, and they both open and they close based on the throttle setting. What pilots want is both of these to operate the same. If there's a malfunction, if one of the engines shuts down or is not producing a normal amount of thrust, you're going to see a difference in the nozzles. Now take a look at that picture the next time you see it. What you'll notice is one of these nozzles is wide open, one of them is closed down. That's a really serious indication of an engine malfunction. That's
important because we have these jets flying over our heads here in San Diego all the time, and it's fun to watch them, but as you know more about them, it's more interesting, isn't it?
It's much more fascinating, and I think that we have the luxury of having a situation where we have both pilots survived and no fatalities. Exactly. So we don't have the somber circumstances associated with most aircraft accidents. So this one perhaps we can examine a little more closely in a little different aspect.
All right, so what goes through the mind of a pilot then? When you're in a situation like this, your wheels up and it's just taking off and something happens, something goes wrong. At that moment, the pilot needs to make probably 1,000 decisions, or at least it seems that, but needs to make those decisions in a split second, right?
Yes, and the key to that is that the decision is made before he even straps into the jet. Because there's literally less than a second or 2 seconds at times to make a decision to abandon an aircraft.
And this is part of the pilot training. It's a mental checklist, if you will, you go through?
It is. It's absolutely part of the training, and we talk about that in our book, of course, extensively to show you how the Air Force and the Navy and any organization that trains pilots at that kind of level takes an ordinary person off of the street and transforms them into a person that can handle flying in high-speed aircraft in the most high-stakes environment imaginable.
Now, I don't want to second-guess pilots. However, we do. That's normal for us to think about. In this case, in Virginia, for instance, could they have made it to another location? Could they have tried to get to the ocean? Here in the San Diego crash, the question was always brought up. Should that pilot have gone to North Island instead of trying to make it to Miramar? Those are decisions that need to be made as well, don't they?
Yes, they are. Okay, taking the Virginia situation first. Because it was a critical phase of flight with two very competent and capable pilots on board, I can assure you.
Critical phrase meaning takeoff.
Critical phase of flight, takeoff and landing, close to the ground. The object of a takeoff, of course, is to get away from the ground and gain airspeed so that you can have time to solve situations and emergencies as they arrive. In that situation, they probably did everything that they could. If you notice the national and the local coverage, there was a comment by Rear Admiral Ted Branch. He's the commander of Naval Air Force Atlantic. I happen to know Admiral Branch very well. And he made the comment that the pilots stayed with the aircraft until the very last moment that they could, and then they had to abandon the aircraft. That's indicative of a situation where they did everything they possibly could. I can guarantee you, if they could have made it to the Atlantic Ocean to bail out, they would have. You brought up the situation here in San Diego. We've addressed this before. That's where a question of judgment has come into play. There was from reading media reports and from reading the accident reports, there was a malfunction, and a decision was made at various levels to overfly possibly a suitable airport, which was North Island,
Right.
and proceed to Miramar. Unfortunately, in that situation, all power was lost, and we know what happened. There was a loss of life.
Well, we talk about making decisions. Sometimes they're good decisions, sometimes they're questionable decisions.
Yes, but going back to the origin of your question is they are split-second decisions at times, particularly in critical phases of flight. That's what the glorious thing is about the military jet pilot training. It prepares you to be able to do that. It can literally transform anybody into that if given the proper amount of training.
Speaking of glorious, I've never had, obviously, even the chance to ride in one of these, and you've had a chance to have the stick in your hand. So is there a way to describe what it is like to sit in that seat and have that airplane under you?
I like the question because it is, at the same time, it's the most exhilarating and the most humbling endeavor that one could ever undertake. Because as we talked about, again, back to the decision-making process, and all of the factors that are involved in keeping this airplane that can literally climb from the ground to 30,000 feet, 5 or 6 miles up in a minute. This particular aircraft, the T-38, has a roll rate of 720 degrees a second. That means in 1 second, this thing can roll twice.
It's a sports car.
1001. It's a sports car. So having the ability, having the honor of being able to fly an aircraft like this is indescribable.
This, I want to just mention this too, this T-38. Isn't that the aircraft that the astronauts fly back and forth for when they do their training?
Absolutely.
I mean, I'm familiar with that because I've covered the shuttle program quite a bit, and I know they always flew in on their T-38s.
They did. They absolutely did. And I have had several astronauts visit when they needed to get a quick check ride out of the way. They'd come to our base at times. Yes, this aircraft is a supersonic two-seat trainer. It flies in excess of Mach 1.3, and the general public was probably most familiar with this because if you've ever seen the Air Force demonstration team called the Thunderbirds, they flew this before they transitioned to the F-16s, and it's still used today in the Air Force pilot training.
All right, so one final comment about these accidents that have happened. Obviously, there's training that goes on to make sure they don't happen. Obviously, the pilots are ready, but they still do happen, don't they? And that's going to happen when you're taking equipment like this and putting it in our skies over sometimes populated areas.
These aircraft are the most complex engineering feats known to man, as you know, from these all the way up to the space shuttle. But the other factor is that they're operated by humans. And anytime you have humans involved, there's potential for human error. The good thing about this situation is that in the military and in aviation in general, anytime there is an accident or an incident, it is investigated and dissected to the extent that probably that particular situation will never happen again because more than any other industry, aviation learns from past mishaps and mistakes.
All right, Bill Hensley, stay with us. Coming up here on San Diego People, we're going to have more with our pilot, and he's going to be joined by his wife, who is also a pilot. And we're going to take a look at their book and what we can learn from it, plus how aviation has changed in the past decade. Stay with us here on San Diego People. We'll be right back.